Okay, so in the previous video I talked about, the truth of stories, whether this is a true war story, whether there's such a thing as a true war story. And I still want to deal with categorization like that, not whether it's true or not, but what kind of story is it? At the end of the story here, we have Tim O'Brien, or we have the narrator say to someone who comes up to him after a reading and says, why don't you just give up writing stories like this and move on and write something happier? And what does he say? He says, it's not a war story, it's a love story. So again, we have this sort of classification. In the previous video I talked about, is this true or is this not true? Is it fiction or nonfiction? There's a real life human being, Tim O'Brien. But in these stories we have the narrator, Tim O'Brien, who is not the same individual as the real Tim O'Brien. It gets really kind of trippy when you think about that. But there's a line between the persona of the narrator and the real life person who wrote the book. So there's the one classification of whether it's true or not, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, because some things in these stories I think did happen, but by and large they're not factually true. So that's one kind of classification. But then, do we classify this as a love story or as a war story? Do you believe that it's a love story? Who is the object of that love, or what is the object of that love would be maybe one question. But the bigger question I have for you that I think is relevant to this story and the other stories by Tim O'Brien, and also other stories in general and really life in general, is that why does it have to be one thing and not the other, right? He says to the woman at the end of the reading, it's not a war story, it's a love story. But couldn't it be both? And I feel like there's this sort of, maybe duality is not the right word, but there's this contradiction, right? Why can't it be a love story and a war story instead of a love story or a war story? And just recently, I've been home with this guy. He sleeps a lot of times in my arms. So I've been watching YouTube videos and lectures, and I've seen some by David Brooks, who's a New York Times columnist, and Malcolm Gladwell, who's written a few books like Blink and The Tipping Point and Outliers. And they've both talked in just the videos that I sort of happen to randomly come across, talk about contradiction in human experience. Looks like he's working on something here. Sorry. So the contradiction in human experience, and that we can be one thing and simultaneously be the opposite of that thing. And we are, maybe we all consider ourselves good people, but we also, as good people, do bad things. So why can't a story at the same time be a war story and a love story, right? I'm reminded of the short story, The Things They Carried, right, where we have Jimmy Cross and Martha, right? So if we had to classify that story really generally, we could call it a war story. It'd be like a very shallow categorization of that story, but it's a war story. But there's also, at the very heart of it, it's about love, right? I mean, I feel like it's a character-driven story. It's not a plot-driven story, and it is about, this love or not love that Jimmy Cross has with Martha. So there's that kind of contradiction. Is it a love story? Is it a war story? And then I'm also interested in the contradictions of the behaviors of these soldiers. And I think we can think about that in the way they act. In The Things They Carried, we have Ted Lavender who dies, right? And what's their reaction to that? Are they all devastated and grief-stricken and they're unable to operate? No, they're not, right? In fact, Sorry. He just ate not too long ago, and apparently things are moving their way through. But Ted Lavender dies, and they joke about it, right? And in a way that seems cruel to us, but I don't think it's cruel at all. I think that's just sort of the coping mechanism. If someone that I know dies, I'm in a situation in my life where I'm afforded the luxury of grieving for them in what we would call it a socially acceptable way, right? Take time off from work, go to the funeral, whatever, cry, be with friends, be with family. These guys don't have that luxury. And so while it seems, I think that at their core a lot of them are good people, even though they say, bang, boom, he fell like a bag of concrete. That's very callous, right? But does that mean these characters are callous at their core, or can they be conflicted or contradictory, right? They can maybe overall be good people that deal with situations in different kinds of ways. And I think that's true in The Things They Carried. We can get, I'm curious, if this were a face-to-face class, we could have quite a discussion about how you feel about Rat Kiley. Is he at his roots a good person, whatever that means, or does this one, what I think we can all kind of say is a terrible, unconscionable act of torturing the water buffalo, does that make him a not good person, a bad person, an evil person, or can he simultaneously be both, right? So the story can occupy, these dual genres. It's a love story, it's a war story, part fiction, part nonfiction, and these people, I think, can occupy the same kind of ambiguous space. Good people who have to do bad things. I mean, that's war, right? I'm sure there are straight out bad people in the war on both sides, but I think for the most part, wars are probably fought by good people who have to do bad things or do things that in the circumstances is not considered bad. I don't judge the guys for the way they talk about Ted Lavender's death and they're sort of callous toward it. I think you have to. Otherwise, psychologically you would not be able to function in that situation. You have to sort of compartmentalize your life and just let things go. Now, Rat Kiley, I mean, that's like a serious act, what he does with the water buffalo. And how do we feel about that? I don't know. I mean, he seems to have this really soft spot. I mean, talk about a love story and a war story. That's a love story that he's got with, Kurt Lemon, right? It's the guy who died. It's like a love story. He says they're like brothers, right? So we have this love story in the middle of a war story, and it turns out, he commits this terrible act of torture to the water buffalo. So before Kurt Lemon dies, is Rat Kiley a good character or a good man? After he dies or after he tortures the water buffalo, is he still a good person? I don't know. Why can't he be both good and bad? I feel like overall I'm a good person, but I do bad things. Shouldn't be a surprise to you guys, shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. It's just sort of part of human nature. And this is one reason why I like this story and some of the stories by Tim O'Brien, because it really gets at that conflicted individual, right? And I think that's a really good commentary on the human condition in general, is that we can be good people who do bad things, or bad, even villains can have sort of soft sides or do things that are unvillain-like. So I like these stories for that reason.